Stop. Don't scroll any further, because this truth about British cinema will send a chill down your spine. You adored them in Doctor Who and Excalibur, but you never knew that their final moments turned into a real-life horror beneath the cold glare of surgical lights. We will reveal unsettling details, from vessels torn apart to a fatal mistake by an anesthesiologist that transformed a routine medical visit into a death sentence. And the final story about a titan of the stage whose heart quite literally burst in the surgeon's hands will leave you shaken. Like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, do you believe it was a tragic coincidence or something far more sinister? Jon Pertwee. The history of British film and television knows many names that became synonymous with entire eras, yet Jon Pertwee stands apart on that list, embodying the very spirit of the old school, where professionalism bordered on recklessness and elegance was an inseparable trait of character. His path to fame was far from easy, but by the mid-1990s, Pertwee had long held the status of a national treasure in Britain. Behind the polished exterior and tireless energy of this tall, silver-haired gentleman, however, lay a fragile human core, worn down by decades of relentless work and his service in the Royal Navy during the Second World War. It was this combination of iron will and failing physical health that led him to the fateful decision which would bring his story to an end on an operating table in distant Connecticut. Jon Pertwee had always been a man of action. His third Doctor in the iconic Doctor Who series was not merely a time traveler, but a true hero of adventure fiction, a master of Venusian Aikido, a lover of fast cars and cutting-edge gadgets. The role was so close to the actor himself that the line between character and man often blurred. Even well into his 70s, he refused to acknowledge old age. He continued attending conventions around the world, recording audio dramas and planning new television projects. But the heart that beat so fiercely within this eccentric gentleman began to falter. Angina and shortness of breath became constant companions, and though Jon tried to hide his weakness from both the public and those closest to him, reality grew harder to ignore. Medical examinations revealed that one of his heart valves required urgent replacement or major reconstruction, otherwise the risk of sudden cardiac arrest would become critical. In May 1996, Jon Pertwee was in the United States. It was a typical trip for him, a blend of work and leisure, filled with meetings with fans and old friends. It was there, in a modern clinic in Connecticut, that he was offered surgery. At the time, American cardiac surgery was considered among the most advanced in the world, and Pertwee, who had always trusted progress and technology, agreed to the procedure. He viewed it as a routine maintenance, like servicing a beloved car. Replace a part, and you're ready to push it to the limit again. Friends later recalled that before heading to the hospital, Jon was in high spirits, joking and showing not a trace of fear. He was used to defeating monsters on screen and had no doubt he would handle this medical formality. But the reality of the operating room proved far harsher than any science fiction script. Preparation for the surgery followed standard protocol. The discipline instilled in him by his British upbringing ensured he followed every instruction without question. The fatal moment came when the anesthesiologists began to induce deep anesthesia. General anesthesia is always a risk, especially for an elderly patient with chronic cardiovascular conditions. As the drugs took effect and the actor's consciousness faded, his heart, already strained by decades of stress and exertion, could not withstand the sudden shift in hemodynamics. His blood pressure dropped to critical levels.
Doctors immediately began resuscitation efforts, trying to restart the vital organ that had abruptly refused to cooperate with the surgeon's scalpel. For hours, the entire operating team fought for the life of the doctor, employing the most advanced methods of stimulation and defibrillation, but his pulse never returned. Jon Pertwee died on May 20th, 1996, on the operating table. It was a tragic irony of fate. A man who had repeatedly returned to life on screen through regeneration became in reality a victim of the fragile human body. News of his death spread instantly around the world, sparking a wave of grief not only in Britain but far beyond its borders. His colleagues were devastated. Tom Baker, his successor as the Doctor, later said that Pertwee had seemed immortal to him, such was the force of his charisma. The fact that the great actor died during a procedure he believed would save him only deepened the tragedy. Jon passed quietly beneath the shadowless glow of surgical lamps, surrounded by sterile instruments, without ever speaking his final words. His body was returned home and cremated in London. In keeping with his vibrant spirit, a small toy, a figurine of Wurzel Gummidge, a character he cherished as much as the Time Lord, was placed upon his coffin. With Pertwee's passing, an entire chapter of British artistry came to an end, a chapter where courage was always paired with refinement, and where fighting till the final breath was the only script life allowed.
Sheri Luni. The tragedy of Sheri Luni is a story of how unjustly and abruptly the flight of one of the brightest and most refined stars of the British screen can be cut short. She was more than an actress. She was a living emblem of aristocratic poise and classical theatrical discipline, a representative of that old school where every gesture is measured to perfection and the voice resonates like a finely tuned instrument. In the public imagination, she remains forever etched as Queen Guinevere from John Boorman's Excalibur, a radiant, almost ethereal beauty behind which stood a will of steel and immense dedication. Yet her life was extinguished at a moment when no one expected disaster, turning a routine medical procedure into a fatal finale that shook London's theatrical community and forced doctors once again to confront the unpredictable nature of the human body under the influence of modern drugs. Her path to fame began on the stage of the Royal Shakespeare Company, where she honed her craft under the guidance of great directors. Sheri possessed a rare range. She appeared equally at home in the heavy brocades of historical dramas and in contemporary thrillers, bringing to every role a measure of British restraint and deep inner intensity. By the middle of her life, she was in excellent physical condition, attentive to her health, and still actively working. However, a minor issue with the veins in her lower limbs began to cause discomfort. It was an ordinary condition faced by thousands, varicose veins, requiring a small cosmetic and functional correction. The procedure was considered minimally invasive and virtually safe, a so-called weekend operation meant to restore lightness to her step and confidence on set. On the appointed day, Sheri arrived at a private London clinic known for its highly qualified staff and advanced equipment. She was calm, even optimistic. New contracts and theatrical premieres awaited her after recovery. The preoperative preparation proceeded as expected. Routine tests revealed no contraindications. Her heart maintained a steady rhythm, and her blood pressure was normal. Nothing foreshadowed the nightmare that would unfold just minutes after anesthesia began. As soon as the anesthesiologist administered the first dose to induce medical sleep, the monitors in the operating room began to sound their alarms. Sheri developed a sudden, fulminant anaphylactic reaction, the rarest and most dangerous complication in which the immune system turns against the body itself in response to a foreign substance. The situation spiraled along the worst possible path.
Within seconds, her airways swelled shut and her blood pressure collapsed to zero. The operating room, moments earlier filled with calm focus, became a battlefield for her life. Surgeons set aside their instruments, yielding to the resuscitation team. Doctors administered adrenaline, corticosteroids, and antihistamines in desperate attempts to halt the shock, but Sheri's body, usually so resilient and obedient, refused to respond. The crisis was compounded by bronchospasm, which deprived her brain of oxygen. Each passing second destroyed millions of neurons, and even if her heart could have been restarted immediately, the consequences for her mind and identity might have been irreversible. But her heart remained stubbornly silent. For 40 minutes, doctors performed chest compressions and fought to restore circulation. Several times they managed to catch a faint rhythm, only for it to dissolve into fibrillation or complete arrest. The full power of British medicine proved helpless against an individual intolerance to the drug, something no test could have predicted. Such reactions occur once in tens of thousands of cases, and it was Sheri Luni who was destined to become part of that tragic statistic. The official time of death was recorded when it became clear that resuscitation efforts were no longer effective. A star whose light should have illuminated audiences for decades faded in the sterile silence of the operating theater, surrounded by masked figures who had done everything possible, yet lost the battle to nature. Her death during such a routine procedure sent shockwaves across the United Kingdom. The press debated the safety of private clinics and the risks of anesthesia, but for her family and colleagues it was first and foremost an irreparable personal loss. She left at the height of her powers, behind unfinished roles and empty seats in theaters. Her Guinevere remains forever on film, a lasting reminder of the fragility of beauty and talent, things that can be undone by a single drop of medicine. This chapter in British cinema became a lesson in humility before chance. Even when medicine seems omnipotent and life feels endless, the line between the glow of stage lights and eternal darkness can be thinner than the edge of a scalpel. Sheri was laid to rest in a closed coffin, and her passing became a symbol of the sudden end of an era of true ladies of the English stage, whose dignity never left them until their final breath.
Sir Cedric Hardwicke. Sir Cedric Hardwicke belonged to that rare lineage of British titans for whom acting was not merely a profession but a sacred calling, once blessed by none other than Bernard Shaw himself. His career unfolded like a grand anthology of dramatic art, beginning on the stages of provincial theatres in the era of King Edward, passing through the fire of the First World War, becoming the youngest knight of the British stage at the time, and ultimately conquering Hollywood while preserving his impeccable Oxford diction and an aura of unshakable dignity. Hardwicke was a master of nuance, an actor who could convey more with a single raised eyebrow than others could with an entire monologue. Yet by the early 1960s, his formidable spirit was betrayed by his own body. Years of habitual smoking and grueling performance schedules led to severe emphysema and chronic lung disease, gradually turning the life of the great elder into a relentless struggle for every breath. His death on the operating table became the final note in the life of a man who had controlled everything except his last breath. By 1964, despite being in his 70s, Sir Cedric remained active and in demand, though physical frailty had begun to impose harsh limits on his craft. A persistent cough interrupted rehearsals, and the need to rely on an oxygen mask backstage wounded his pride. Hardwicke had always been a man of action and refused to fade away slowly in a wheelchair, clinging to memories of former glory. When doctors offered a radical solution, a complex lung surgery that could, in theory, restore part of his breathing capacity and free him from constant suffocation, he agreed almost immediately.
It was a risk, and the physicians were frank about the possible consequences given his age and the condition of his cardiovascular system. But for Hardwicke, who had played kings and prophets, the choice between a diminished shadow of life and a chance to return fully to his craft was obvious. He regarded the upcoming operation as another demanding performance, one that simply required careful preparation. The procedure was to take place in one of New York's leading hospitals, where Hardwicke had spent his final years. Even within the confines of a hospital room, he remained true to himself, reading memoirs, dictating letters, and receiving visitors with the same graciousness he had shown in his London residence. Yet medicine of that era, despite its advancements, remained perilous for patients with such severe respiratory disease. Anesthesia in the mid-1960s was a delicate balance between life and death, especially in surgeries involving the very organs of breathing. Sir Cedric's body was already exhausted by chronic hypoxia, his heart working beyond its endurance to compensate for the lack of oxygen in his blood. On August 6, 1964, he was wheeled into the operating room. Calm and composed, he gave a faint nod to the staff, displaying the stoic restraint that had made him a legend. The catastrophe began as the operation entered its critical phase. Opening the chest is itself a profound shock to the body, and operating on lungs ravaged by emphysema demands extraordinary precision. At one point, the fragile, disease-altered tissues gave way and massive internal bleeding began. Blood vessels, thinned by years of pathology, ruptured under the surgeon's instruments, and the operative field was quickly flooded. The anesthesiologist recorded a sharp drop in oxygen levels and a critical fall in blood pressure. Sir Cedric's heart, already beating at the edge of its endurance, could not withstand the sudden loss of circulating blood volume. The monitors flattened into a single line. Doctors initiated emergency open resuscitation, attempting to stimulate the heart directly, but the tissues were too weakened to respond. The great actor slipped away beneath the surgeon's hands, never emerging from the deep anesthesia into which he had entered with hope for recovery. The death of Sir Cedric Hardwicke on the operating table sent shockwaves through theatrical circles on both sides of the Atlantic. He died as, perhaps, a true actor would wish, to the very end fighting to remain in the ranks. His passing marked the symbolic close of the era of great knights. Those who still remembered Shakespeare performed in the style of the 19th century and carried that grandeur into the age of television. The tragedy lay in the fact that medicine he had trusted proved powerless against the accumulated weight of years and cigarettes. Hardwicke left behind a monumental legacy, more than 100 roles, each bearing the mark of genius. His death on surgery was discussed in medical journals as a stark example of the challenges of treating elderly patients, but for millions of viewers he remained the wise, slightly weary gentleman with the piercing gaze. He was laid to rest in London, and one could imagine Shaw's words engraved upon his tomb, that this man had never known defeat on the stage, losing only in a quiet, sterile operating room where his breath ceased forever. His life had been a long monologue, cut off mid-sentence, leaving behind a profound silence in the hearts of those who understood the true greatness of the old British school. At his funeral, they did not speak of a failed operation, but of how, even in dying, he preserved his dignity, refusing to let frailty conquer him entirely. Sir Cedric Hardwicke departed as a true Titan, felled by a fate sharper than any surgeon's blade, yet preserved in the history of cinema, untouched by time or decay.
Gertrude Lawrence. Gertrude Lawrence was not merely an actress. She was the very embodiment of British brilliance, a woman whose laughter could light up the entire West End and whose slightest gesture could hold thousands spellbound on Broadway. In the history of the old theatrical school, she held a singular place.
the queen of the musical, the muse of Noel Coward, an icon of style whose influence reached far beyond the stage. Her life sparkled like champagne, effervescent with success, glittering soirees, and endless applause. Yet behind that radiant facade was a body worn down by decades of iron discipline and relentless physical strain. The tragedy of Gertrude Lawrence on the operating table became one of the bitterest chapters of the golden age of theater, proving that even the brightest star can burn out in an instant under the merciless glare of surgical lights when its inner reserves are drained to nothing. By the early 1950s, Gertrude had reached the pinnacle of her fame. Her triumph as Anna Leonovens in the original production of The King and I turned her into a living legend. She performed the grueling role 8 times a week, dancing in heavy crinolines and delivering demanding vocal numbers, despite being well into her 50s. To the audience, she seemed eternally youthful and vibrant, but behind the scenes, she increasingly pressed a hand to her side, concealing sharp bursts of pain from her colleagues. Raised in the tradition that the show must go on, she ignored her body's warnings until she collapsed during a rehearsal, making medical intervention unavoidable. Doctors discovered a tumor in her liver and serious complications in her biliary system. In 1952, such a diagnosis was deeply troubling, yet surgeons offered cautious optimism, believing that removing the affected tissue would restore their leading lady to the stage. The operation was scheduled for early September in New York. Gertrude, possessed of inexhaustible optimism, joked with the nurses until the very last moment and spoke of her triumphant return to the stage within a month. She did not know that her liver, strained by years of stress, sleeplessness, and medications required to sustain her performance, was already on the brink of collapse. General anesthesia in those years carried significant risk and demanded tremendous effort from the body's detoxifying organs. When Gertrude was wheeled into the operating room, she appeared fragile yet still regal. The first minutes of the procedure passed without incident. The surgeons began their work, but as the anesthesia reached its full depth, her vital systems began to fail. Her liver simply could not process the administered drugs, triggering rapid intoxication and a sudden paralysis of the heart muscle. A heavy silence fell over the operating room, broken only by the sharp commands of the lead surgeon. Gertrude's heart stopped abruptly, without warning, like a wound clock that had simply run down. The doctors launched into desperate resuscitation efforts, direct cardiac massage, stimulant injections into the myocardium, artificial ventilation at extreme pressure. For 40 minutes, they fought to save the life of a woman who had been the soul of London and New York, but it was in vain. A body that had spent decades burning itself out for art refused to go on. Gertrude Lawrence died on September 6, 1952, without regaining consciousness, a victim of her own devotion and the limitations of anesthesiology at the time. Her death sent shockwaves through the theatrical world. On the day of her funeral, the lights of every theater on Broadway and in the West End were dimmed for a full minute, a tribute no actor had ever received. Her passing on the operating table marked the end of an entire era of theatrical glamour. It emerged that she had concealed her illness for months, afraid of letting down her company and her audience, and that very delay made the operation fatal. She died like a true soldier of the stage, felled not by a bullet, but by a scalpel meant to save her life, only to underscore the finality of biological limits. Her stage partner Yul Brynner later recalled that after her death, the stage of The King and I felt empty and cold, as though life itself had departed the theater. Gertrude Lawrence remains in memory as a woman who danced to the very end, until the last spotlight faded in the sterile whiteness of a hospital room. Her tragedy became a lesson for many artists of the old school, a reminder that behind the brilliance of success stands a vulnerable human being whose heart may fail at the most inopportune moment, turning applause into a requiem. She was laid to rest in the very pink ballroom gown in which she performed her famous Shall We Dance, a symbol of an eternal striving for beauty that not even death during surgery could extinguish. Gertrude departed, leaving behind the faint trace of expensive perfume and the memory of a voice that would never again be heard live, reminding us how dearly devotion to one's calling can cost, and how suddenly the curtain may fall before an actor has spoken their final line. The chapter of her life closed in an operating room, yet the legend of Gertrude Lawrence endures as proof that true greatness does not fear time, even when it proves powerless before a fatal medical misfortune.
Jack Hawkins. Jack Hawkins was not merely an actor, he was the living embodiment of the British spirit, that unshakable stiff upper lip that never trembled in the face of adversity. His granite-carved features and deep, rumbling voice, like distant rolls of thunder, made him the perfect choice for officers, gentlemen, and war heroes. From the bridge on the River Kwai to Lawrence of Arabia, Hawkins brought an unmistakable authority and masculine dignity to every role. Yet, behind that facade of unwavering strength lay a long and private struggle that turned the final years of his life into a relentless battle for the right to speak. The tragedy of Jack Hawkins is the story of a man who lost his greatest instrument, his voice, and died on the operating table in a desperate attempt to reclaim it. It was a clash between old-school resolve and an unforgiving illness, ending in the sterile silence of an operating room where sheer will met the limits of the human body. The trouble began in the mid-1960s when Hawkins, a heavy smoker who consumed up to 3 packs a day, noticed a persistent hoarseness. True to his generation, he ignored the symptoms for as long as he could, dismissing them as fatigue and strain. But in 1966, the diagnosis came like a sentence: laryngeal cancer. The only way to save his life was a total laryngectomy, the complete removal of his voice box. For an actor whose voice was his signature, it meant professional death. Yet Hawkins showed extraordinary courage. After the surgery, he did not retreat into silence, but learned to speak using esophageal speech, a hollow, strained whisper that required immense effort. He continued acting, while his roles were dubbed by Charles Gray. Still, Jack never abandoned the hope of truly speaking again. He longed for the day he could address the world without intermediaries, and that longing led him toward a series of experimental procedures. By 1973, medicine offered a new possibility: the implantation of an artificial voice valve designed to connect the trachea and esophagus, allowing clearer speech to form. Jack Hawkins seized this chance with the desperation of a drowning man. By then, his health had been severely weakened by years of radiation therapy and chronic respiratory infections. He knew the risks were immense, but the prospect of silence terrified him more than the surgeon's knife. The operation was scheduled at St. Stephen's Hospital in London. Hawkins entered the clinic with his head held high, carrying the same stern presence of the colonel audiences admired. He believed this procedure would be his personal victory day, a triumph of will over biological ruin. But the tissues of his throat, repeatedly exposed to radiation, had long since lost their capacity to heal. During the surgery, which at first appeared to be proceeding successfully, unforeseen complications arose. The irradiated tissues, fragile and thinned, began to bleed at the slightest touch. Surgeons found that blood vessels were crumbling beneath their instruments. Massive internal bleeding followed, extremely difficult to control in such a confined and vital area. The situation worsened as anatomical changes from the earlier operation made it nearly impossible to reach the source of the hemorrhage. In the struggle to stop the bleeding, fluid entered the actor's lungs, causing immediate aspiration and respiratory arrest. Hawkins' heart, already weakened by cancer and years of strain, began to fail.
The monitors recorded a critical arrhythmia that quickly deteriorated into fibrillation. Doctors fought desperately to save the legend, performing resuscitation amid the chaos of the open surgical field. But nature proved stronger than medicine. Jack Hawkins died on July 18, 1973, never regaining consciousness. His death shocked Britain, for he had been a symbol of endurance. There was a bitter irony in the fact that a man who had survived countless battles on screen and a real war with cancer died simply trying to say hello to his loved ones in his own voice. His passing highlighted the dangerous line between the pursuit of quality of life and the fatal risks of surgery in the presence of chronic illness. Hawkins remains in history as a warrior who was not afraid to risk everything for his identity. His final role on the operating table became proof that men of the old British school did not know how to surrender to circumstance. They chose to die striving to reclaim what was lost rather than endure a life of silence. After his death, colleagues did not dwell on the failed operation, but on the extraordinary dignity with which he bore the burden of being a voiceless actor, and on the fact that even his death was an act of courage. The theaters of London lowered their flags, mourning the man whose voice fell silent forever, yet whose spirit remained unbroken to the very last second beneath anesthesia. His life was a triumph of will, and his death a tragic reminder that medicine has its limits, beyond which lies only eternal silence and the memory of a master.
Kay Walsh. Kay Walsh was one of those rare actresses whose presence on screen defined the very texture of British cinema's golden age, infusing it with a sense of true psychological depth and an almost tangible earthbound wisdom. She never chased cheap effects or flamboyant glamour, belonging instead to a stronger and honest school of acting, where mastery was measured by the depth of one's understanding of human nature. The muse and wife of the great director David Lean, she shone in masterpieces such as Great Expectations and Oliver Twist, creating characters that etched themselves into the audience's memory with their piercing authenticity. Even as her career entered the stage of dignified longevity, Kay remained an icon for new generations of performers, embodying the continuity of West End traditions and the legacy of Britain's Pinewood studios. Yet the final chapter of her long life, which stretched across nearly a century, became tragically tied to an operating table, where the fragility of a 93-year-old body entered an unequal struggle with the necessity of surgery, turning an attempt to relieve pain into the last act of her life's drama. By 2005, Kay Walsh was 93. Despite her venerable age, she retained the sharp mind and rives glad that had once captivated critics. She lived in London's Chelsea district, remaining as engaged in cultural life as her health allowed. Tragedy came in the form of an accident that for people of her age often marks a fatal turning point. A fall in her own home resulted in a severe fracture of the femoral neck. In geriatric medicine, such an injury is considered critical. Without surgery, the patient is condemned to complete immobility and excruciating pain, inevitably leading to pneumonia and decline within weeks. Faced with this reality, both the doctors and Kay herself confronted a harrowing choice. On one hand, general anesthesia and major surgery at 93 carried risks bordering on the unthinkable. On the other, leaving a legendary actress to suffer without hope of walking again was equally impossible. True to her character as a woman of the old school, Kay chose to fight. She consented to the operation, placing her hope in both a miracle and the skill of British surgeons. The preparation for surgery was carried out with the utmost caution. Doctors at St. George's Hospital in London understood they were treating a living piece of history. Kay's heart, though stable, bore the marks of age, and her blood vessels were as fragile as parchment. The anesthesiologists developed a gentle protocol, striving to minimize toxic strain on her kidneys and brain. On the day of the operation, Kay appeared calm. She even joked with the nurses, displaying the same composure that had once helped her endure long hours of filming in the cold studios of post-war Britain.
As she was wheeled into the operating room, it seemed that her lifelong discipline would carry her through this trial as well. But the body's biological clock cannot be deceived, even by the strongest will. As anesthesia was administered, it became clear that her adaptive reserves were stretched to their limit. The surgical procedure itself, the insertion of a metal pin, was technically successful. The surgeons worked swiftly and skillfully, striving to minimize the time she spent under anesthesia. But the true crisis came as she emerged from the medicated sleep. Kay Walsh's body, which had endured the mechanical intervention, began to lose control over its vital functions. In the recovery room, as the effects of the drugs were expected to fade, she developed acute cardiopulmonary failure. It was the toll of accumulated strain. Her heart, having mobilized all its strength during surgery, could not return to a normal rhythm. Her blood pressure began to fall, and her lungs, even with mechanical support, failed to oxygenate her blood adequately. For hours, doctors fought to stabilize her condition, using every available resuscitative measure, but her 93-year-old body simply shut down, having exhausted its life's reserves to the very last drop. Kay Walsh died on April 16, 2005. Formally, the operation had been completed, but in reality it became the direct cause of her death, as recovery never began. Her passing marked the quiet end of an entire era. She died in the stillness of a hospital room, never knowing that her attempt to return to an active life had failed. Obituaries wrote that Britain had lost its last great lady of the screen, a woman who preserved her dignity and courage to the very end. A tragedy on the operating table at such an age is always a matter of medical debate, but for Kay it was the only dignified choice. She preferred to risk everything for the chance to move again rather than accept a motionless decline. Her life had been filled with the glow of stage lights and applause, and though her final scene unfolded in an operating room, it underscored her refusal to surrender to old age without a fight. She is remembered by her colleagues as a woman of immense inner strength, whose death during medical intervention became merely the final stroke in the portrait of a great artist unafraid to face any trial. Kay was laid to rest without unnecessary pomp, in accordance with her wishes, yet the void left by her departure is still felt in British art to this day. She was an actress for whom the truth of life mattered more than any set design, and even her death in a hospital became a bitter but honest testament to the limits of human endurance beyond which lies eternity. Her name is forever inscribed in the history of the old school, and the circumstances of her passing remain a reminder that even the most celebrated figures of stage and screen ultimately stand alone before the merciless passage of time and the helplessness of medicine in the face of deep old age. Kay Walsh departed, leaving behind her films as a testament to a spirit that even a fatal anesthetic could not break.
Robert Newton. Robert Newton was a force of nature on the British screen, a man whose acting style was as untamed and powerful as the storms of the Caribbean he so often evoked in his most famous roles. A product of the old school, he possessed a magnetism that could not be ignored, bulging eyes, a thunderous voice, and that unmistakable West Country accent combined to create the definitive image of the pirate as we know it today. It was Newton who gave the world the iconic Long John Silver, a portrayal that became the benchmark for generations of actors to follow. Yet behind the on-screen ferocity and charisma stood a man tormented by inner demons, chief among them a long and severe battle with alcoholism. This destructive habit not only eroded his career and personal life, but also reduced his body to a fragile structure, ready to collapse under the slightest strain. The tragedy of Robert Newton on an operating table in Beverly Hills became a grim but inevitable conclusion to the life of an artist who burned the candle at both ends, only to be undone by anesthesia that proved for him a fatal poison. By the mid-1950s, Newton's health had reached a critical state. Despite his immense earnings and global fame, he was a prisoner of his own habits. His liver had been nearly destroyed by cirrhosis, while his cardiovascular system functioned under extreme stress from constant intoxication.
In 1956, during the filming of Around the World in 80 Days, where he played Inspector Fix, his condition worsened dramatically. Persistent abdominal pain and overwhelming weakness forced him to seek medical attention. The diagnosis demanded immediate surgical intervention. A serious problem involving his intestines and bile ducts left no alternative. Newton, accustomed to risk and convinced of his own invincibility, agreed to the operation with the ease of a man who had faced death countless times on screen. He did not realize that to the surgeon and anesthesiologist, his body was a minefield where any dose of anesthesia could trigger a catastrophic system failure. The operation was scheduled for March 25, 1956. At the time, methods of monitoring patients under anesthesia were far from advanced, and understanding of how chronic alcohol abuse altered the metabolism of anesthetic drugs was only beginning to emerge. For Robert Newton, general anesthesia became the fatal trigger. As he slipped into a deep medicated sleep, his liver, unable to process the drugs effectively, began to fail. This set off a cascade of events. A sharp drop in blood pressure led to myocardial hypoxia. The surgeons, barely underway, realized that his blood was no longer properly oxygenated and his heart rhythm had become erratic. In the sterile silence of the operating room, urgent commands broke out. The anesthesiologists attempted to stabilize his pressure with adrenaline, but Newton's worn-out vessels failed to respond. The situation escalated into clinical death in the midst of the procedure. Doctors performed direct cardiac massage, desperately trying to revive a man who had been joking in the dressing room only the day before. But no miracle came. At 50 years old, the body of the king of pirates gave out. His heart delivered one final beat and fell silent forever. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack brought on by complications during surgery, yet everyone understood that the true culprit was the life he had lived for decades. Newton's death on the operating table shocked both Hollywood and Britain. He left before completing his final projects, leaving behind a void that could not be filled. Colleagues later recalled that Newton always acted as if each performance might be his last, and in the end, that very intensity consumed him from within. The tragedy of Robert Newton underscored the dangerous link between an actor's physical condition and the risks of modern medicine. For the old school, where self-destruction was often seen as a companion to genius, his death became a harsh reminder that the body has limits. He died beneath the glare of surgical lights, never awakening, never speaking a final word, like one of his own characters, sinking with his ship into the depths. His Long John Silver lives on, forever vibrant on screen, while the real Robert Newton remains in that operating room of 1956, a casualty of a body burdened by its past. His funeral was quiet, but the memory of his talent and his tragic end continues to serve as both a warning and a somber chapter in the history of British acting. He was a great artist whose final performance unfolded without an audience, surrounded by doctors forced to lower their hands in the face of the inevitable. Newton departed, leaving behind the right to be remembered as a legend, his voice still echoing in the minds of millions, a reminder of an era when actors were larger than life and paid the highest price for it.
Margaret Leighton. Margaret Leighton was one of those rare, almost ethereal figures of the British stage whose presence on screen or in the theatre felt like a brush with the highest form of aristocratic grace. She was often called an actress's actress, a tribute to her exquisite technique and the extraordinary emotional fragility that became her signature. Margaret belonged to the golden generation of the old school, shaped by the rigorous discipline of the BBC and the classical productions of the Old Vic. Her finely sculpted features, high forehead, and piercing, introspective gaze made her the perfect interpreter of women marked by broken destinies,
figures who concealed a storm of passion beneath a composed exterior. A Tony Award winner and an Academy Award nominee, she became a muse to directors who saw in her the embodiment of British elegance. Yet behind this luminous facade lay a long and exhausting struggle with an invisible enemy, multiple sclerosis. A treacherous disease of the central nervous system had begun to affect her coordination and stamina. Yet Leighton, driven by a characteristically British stubbornness, refused to retreat. She continued to take the stage, overcoming weakness in her legs, and appeared in films, drawing on every nuance of her craft to conceal the progression of her illness. But in early 1976, a separate medical issue arose, one that required surgical intervention. It was not related to her multiple sclerosis, such procedures were not yet common, but rather a complication in the abdominal region that caused acute pain and threatened serious consequences. Doctors at Chichester Hospital, where Margaret was under observation, insisted on surgery. Exhausted by constant discomfort, she agreed, hoping that relief from this pain would restore her strength and allow her to continue acting. She viewed it as a temporary obstacle, something to be stepped over and left behind. The fateful day arrived on January 13, 1976. Margaret entered the clinic with her usual dignity, though her body had been worn thin by years of struggle. In the anesthesiology of that era, the combination of multiple sclerosis and general anesthesia was considered highly risky. The nervous system of patients with such a diagnosis could react unpredictably to muscle relaxants and deep sedation. Nerve conduction might fail catastrophically, leading to paralysis of the respiratory center or a critical disruption of heart rhythm. Moreover, years of medication to manage her condition had created a complex chemical balance in her body, one that interacted unpredictably with anesthetic drugs. As she was wheeled into the operating room, she appeared alarmingly fragile, like a porcelain figure that might crack at the slightest touch. The induction of anesthesia began routinely, but as the surgeons moved into the main phase of the procedure, the monitors signaled a sudden and severe destabilization. Margaret developed an acute autonomic reaction. Her nervous system, already compromised by damaged myelin sheaths, effectively shut down control of her heart. Cardiac arrest followed, not from bleeding or surgical error, but from a systemic failure to withstand the stress of anesthesia. The operating room was instantly transformed into a scene of urgent struggle. Doctors used defibrillation, administered stimulants, and carried out intensive resuscitation, fighting to restart her heart. For a brief moment they succeeded in restoring a rhythm, but the damage inflicted on her brain during the loss of circulation, combined with her underlying illness, made recovery impossible. The great actress died without regaining consciousness in the midst of a procedure that had been meant to save her. Margaret Leighton's death at the age of 53 was a devastating blow to British art. She stood at a point in life when actresses of her caliber often enter their most profound and defining roles. Her husband, the actor John Gielgud, along with friends from the old guard, was shattered by the suddenness of her loss. The tragedy on the operating table underscored the fragile line walked by those with serious chronic illnesses who must undergo surgery. Margaret died as a true warrior of the stage, concealing her frailty to the last, striving to repair herself for the sake of future roles. Her passing became a reminder that behind the brilliance of awards and acclaim lies a daily act of physical endurance. She remains in memory as a woman of extraordinary beauty and talent, whose life was cut short in the sterile silence of a hospital, beneath the cold light of surgical lamps, leaving dozens of great roles forever unplayed. Leighton was laid to rest in Chichester, and at her farewell it was said that she had been too refined for this harsh world, that her heart, worn by struggle, had simply chosen rest at the moment when medicine tried to intrude upon its fragile realm. Her films and recorded performances still stand as a standard of acting excellence, while the story of her death during surgery remains a somber chapter in the chronicle of the old British school, where devotion to the craft often came at the highest cost. She left before age could touch her on screen, forever remaining that same enigmatic and luminous Margaret, whose voice fades into eternity, leaving us alone with the silence of an empty stage.
Nigel Patrick. Nigel Patrick was the very essence of mid-20th century British elegance, an actor whose presence on screen instantly infused a scene with the atmosphere of Mayfair's private clubs, impeccably tailored Savile Row suits, and that subtle, almost imperceptible irony reserved for true gentlemen of the old school. His career, which began on the stage before the Second World War, reached its peak in the 1950s, when he became one of the most recognizable faces in British cinema. Patrick possessed a rare gift. He could portray heroes and adventurers with equal charm, all while maintaining that distance and composure that made him the perfect embodiment of national character. He did not simply play roles, he projected a way of life where discipline coexisted with ease and professionalism with effortless grace. Yet the final chapter of his life, which came in September 1981, became a tragic example of how a perfectly calibrated human destiny can be shattered by a fatal technical failure in the very place meant to be safest, a modern operating room. The tragedy of Nigel Patrick is the story of a man who cared for himself and planned for a long life, only to fall victim not to illness, but to a systemic breakdown that turned a routine procedure into a death sentence. At 70, Nigel Patrick remained in remarkable physical condition. He continued working, not only as an actor, but also as a successful director, commanding immense respect within the industry. The only issue that troubled him was periodic pain in the right upper abdomen, a classic symptom of gallstones. In 1981, examinations revealed that the stones in his gallbladder had reached a critical size and could block the ducts, potentially leading to severe peritonitis. Surgical removal of the gallbladder, or cholecystectomy, had long been considered a routine operation with minimal risk. Patrick, a rational man accustomed to trusting professionals, agreed to the planned procedure without hesitation. He regarded his hospital stay as an inconvenient but necessary pause in a busy schedule, fully expecting to return to rehearsals within a couple of weeks. On September 21, 1981, Patrick arrived at a London hospital in excellent spirits. His tests were ideal for his age, his heart steady, his lungs clear. Preparation proceeded as usual, and he was wheeled into the operating room. Anesthesia began according to standard protocol, muscle relaxants were administered, and he was connected to a mechanical ventilator. It was at this critical moment, when a patient's life rests entirely in the hands of machines and medical staff, that disaster struck, a black swan event in British anesthesiology. Due to a technical defect in the gas delivery system or an error in the connection of the lines, investigations later pointed to a critical failure in oxygen concentration. Nigel Patrick's body began to suffocate at a cellular level. The monitors displayed normal pressure readings, yet the blood circulating through his veins carried almost no oxygen. The first signs of trouble appeared just as the surgeon made the initial incision. Assistants noticed that the blood had turned dark, nearly black, a direct sign of hypoxia. At that very moment, the heart monitor, which had shown a stable rhythm, erupted into alarm. Deprived of oxygen, Patrick's heart fell into fibrillation, chaotic contractions that failed to sustain circulation. Panic broke out in the operating room, concealed beneath a veneer of professional control. The anesthesiologist frantically checked hoses and cylinders, trying to understand why the patient's lungs were not absorbing the mixture. Even manual ventilation proved useless, as the gas itself was defective.
For several critical minutes, the actor's brain was starved of oxygen. Surgeons halted the operation and immediately began defibrillation. Shock after shock jolted Nigel's body, but the oxygen-deprived heart would not respond. The fight for Patrick's life lasted nearly 40 minutes. Doctors managed to restore a semblance of rhythm, but it was too late. Irreversible damage to the cerebral cortex and necrosis of cardiac tissue caused by prolonged oxygen deprivation made survival impossible. Nigel Patrick died without regaining consciousness on the operating table, never completing the simple procedure that was meant to extend his life. His death became a major scandal in the British medical community. A full-scale investigation followed, leading to stricter standards for checking anesthesia and ventilation equipment before every operation. The bitter irony was that a man whose life embodied control and order died because of a catastrophic disorder within a technical system. Patrick passed away in the prime of his late autumn, leaving behind dozens of roles in which he remains forever the unflappable officer, unshaken by any storm. In London's theatrical circles, his death was difficult to accept. Colleagues called it an exit not in the script, a tragic miscue by fate itself. Patrick was not terminally ill, nor worn down by years of struggle. He had simply trusted a system that failed at the worst possible moment. His funeral was solemn, overshadowed by a profound sense of injustice. The old British school lost one of its most elegant representatives, not on a battlefield, nor in the quiet of his home, but under the cold gaze of a faulty gauge. Nigel Patrick remains a symbol of an era when acting was the art of nuance, and his tragic end became a harsh lesson for the medicine of the 1980s. Every patient who has gone under anesthesia in Britain, in some measure, owes their safety to the terrible price this great actor paid simply for the right to breathe in the hands of professionals. His films continue to radiate the confidence and light he carried, concealing behind the frame the silence of the operating room that became his final frontier. The chapter of his life closed abruptly, without applause, leaving only the question of how many more stories he might have told had it not been for that fatal turn of a valve on a September morning in 1981. Patrick departed, leaving behind his perfect image, untouched by frailty or prolonged illness, forever preserved in the moment of his eternal, if interrupted, triumph.
Sir Donald Wolfitt. Sir Donald Wolfitt was the last of the great titans of the British stage, a true actor-manager whose life and career were a relentless battle for the honour of classical theatre. At a time when cinema had already begun to dictate its own rules and television was entering every home, Wolfitt remained steadfastly loyal to the traditions of the 19th century, touring with his company to the most remote corners of Britain to bring Shakespeare to those who needed it most. He was a man of colossal energy, whose voice could fill any auditorium without amplification, and whose portrayals of Lear and Richard III were regarded as benchmarks of power and passion. A representative of the old school, where an actor did not merely perform a role, but lived it as a physical ordeal, Wolfitt had long grown accustomed to ignoring fatigue, pain, and the warnings of doctors. For him, the stage was the only place where life held meaning, and it was this fierce determination to remain in the ranks until his final breath that led him to his fatal end on an operating table in February 1968. The tragedy of Donald Wolfitt is the story of a man who sought to repair his worn-out heart for one last curtain call, only to discover that the curtain would fall far sooner than even the surgeons had expected. By the mid-1960s, Sir Donald's health had begun to decline rapidly. Decades of grueling tours, sleepless nights spent in cold trains, and the immense emotional strain of performing great tragic roles had taken their toll. His heart, which he had long forced to beat in rhythm with the cadences of Shakespearean verse, began to falter dangerously.
Angina became his constant companion, and bouts of breathlessness forced him to spend long hours in oxygen tents between acts. Yet Wolfitt, a man of iron will, refused to retire. He continued to appear on screen in films such as Lawrence of Arabia and Beckett, bringing with him that same weighty, almost tangible theatrical force. When doctors at a London clinic informed him that without major surgical intervention on his vessels and valves, his life could end at any moment, he did not hear a sentence, he heard a challenge. He agreed to the operation with a single goal, to gain a few more years of active creative life. Preparations for the operation in February 1968 were made with full awareness of the risks associated with his age and general exhaustion. At the time, cardiac surgery in Britain stood on the threshold of major breakthroughs, yet it remained an extraordinarily dangerous field. Anesthesia for a patient with such a complex array of cardiovascular conditions required the utmost precision. Wolfitt entered the clinic as though it were the Old Vic on opening night, head held high, issuing instructions, making plans for the upcoming season. He did not believe in defeat. To him, the operating room was merely another set scene where he would play his most difficult role yet, the man who defeats death. But reality offered no theatrical grandeur. As he was wheeled into the sterile unit, life support monitors already recorded critical instability in his heart rhythm during premedication. The body of the great tragedian was worn to its limits, like old stage scenery held together by little more than will. The catastrophe struck at the height of the operation. Surgeons attempted to restore blood flow in the coronary arteries, but the vessel tissues proved so fragile that they could not withstand suturing. Massive bleeding followed, and against the backdrop of his existing heart failure, it led to a sudden collapse in blood pressure. The heart of the great actor, which he had driven beyond its limits for so many years, abruptly stopped. The operating room erupted into a desperate struggle. Doctors performed direct cardiac massage, employed the most advanced stimulators available at the time, but the great actor's engine refused to start again. Sir Donald Wolfitt died on February 17, 1968, never emerging from deep anesthesia. It was a quiet passing into medicated oblivion, in stark contrast to the thunderous brilliance of his life. He died in an attempt to reclaim his right to work, becoming a victim of the very devotion that had made him a legend. Wolfitt's death on the operating table marked the final end of an era of great independent actor-managers. Obituaries declared that with his passing, Britain had lost the last of the Mohicans, a man for whom theatre was a religion and the stage an altar. The tragedy in the hospital underscored the steep price paid by artists of the old school for their refusal to grow old and surrender. Wolfitt did not wish to spend his final years confined to a wheelchair. He chose instead to risk everything for the chance of a full return. His funeral in London gathered the entire theatrical elite, and many said that Donald departed like a true tragic hero, falling in battle against frailty, preserving his dignity and loyalty to his calling until the final second beneath the surgeon's scalpel. His leer, mad and majestic, remains forever etched in history, while the circumstances of his death serve as a somber reminder that even the greatest will is powerless before the laws of biology. So Donald Wolfitt left behind a void that no new generation of actors could fully fill, for he was among the last who could turn every word into an event of universal magnitude. His life ended in sterile silence, yet the echo of his voice still lingers in the corridors of British theatres, recalling a time when art demanded everything a person had, down to the final beat of the heart on an operating table. He departed before finishing his monologue, yet the silence that followed carried more weight than any speech, becoming the final line in a grand play called The Old British School. Wolfitt was laid to rest with honours, but his true monument lives in the thousands who once saw him perform and understood what uncompromising greatness meant, even in the face of death. His death during surgery became an act of courage, a final attempt to defy fate and return to the glow of the stage lights he loved more than life itself. And though medicine lost that battle, the spirit of Donald Wolfitt remained undefeated, fixed forever in the image of a king who never laid down his crown.
In drawing this sombre chronicle to a close, one cannot help but see the profound dramatic thread that binds the fates of these 10 remarkable masters of the old British school. The operating table, meant to be a place of healing and return to life, became for each of them a final stage, where the harsh glow of surgical lamps replaced the footlights, and the sterile silence of the clinic stood in for the roar of applause. The tragedy of these great artists lies not only in medical failures or cruel accidents, but in the very nature of their existence. They belonged to a generation that gave itself entirely to the craft, often ignoring the warnings of their own bodies for the sake of the show that had to go on. Whether it was a sudden allergic reaction, as in the case of Sheri Luni, or a technical failure that cut short the life of Nigel Patrick, each story underscores the fragility of human genius when faced with biological reality and the imperfect technologies of past decades. These were people who did not fear risk, who went under the surgeon's knife in the hope of reclaiming a voice like Jack Hawkins, or restoring movement like Walsh, because for them a life without creation was unthinkable. Their deaths on the operating table became a final act of courage, an attempt to overcome weakness and age for the chance of one more curtain call. Today, their stories stand as a stark reminder that even the most celebrated titans of screen and stage remain vulnerable, their lives capable of ending in a single instant through a drop of anesthetic or the tremor of a faulty gauge. And yet, despite their tragic ends in the confines of operating rooms, their true legacy remains untouched. Their artistry, captured on film, their impeccable diction, and the spirit of the old school endure, proving that art ultimately outlives death, even when it claims the creator at the most unjust and untimely moment. These 10 names are forever etched into history, not merely as victims of medical circumstance, but as great devotees of their craft, men and women who fought until their final breath for the right to remain in the ranks and to share the light of their talent with the world.